In this lecture, let's go ahead and understand components in React. So what exactly is component? So as we all know that React is based on the component architecture. So a component is nothing but it's a part of user interface. And a component is one of the core building blocks of React. So that means whenever you're building a React application, that is nothing but it's an application built with a set of components. Any application which you build in React would comprise of small components combined together, and these small components combined together would form the entire user interface. Now, the best thing about components is that these components can be nested inside one another, which means that if you have a component, you could have another component in it. So this is what a component is in brief terms. Now, in order to understand components in a much more better way, let's take a look at Google's homepage, which is simply a search page. However, you will see that there are multiple elements on this specific web page. Now, in this page, the top navbar which you have up over here, which has options like Gmail and images, this navbar could be considered as one component. Now the navbar itself could have multiple small components, like we have this particular image component, we have this particular button component right up over here which pops up a bunch of options, and we also have these two links over here as well. This means inside this particular navbar component we have other components nested. Now at this location we have another component which might be called as a search component, and this search component is again comprised of other components. So for example, this search component has this particular image nested inside it, which is a search image. And again we have another component which is this particular microphone button right up over here. Now all the components which we see on this page are merged together to make a parent component. So that means in this particular navbar we have these nested components, in this particular search bar we have these nested components, and this whole page as one is also a component which is comprised of all these small components combined together. Now the best part about components is that these components could be reused. So every component which you create is reusable, and same components can be used multiple times with different properties to display different information. For example, the component used to display these languages. So for example, this right here is one component, this here is another component. They are actually the same components here, but the only thing is the content inside those components differ. So this is how the components are reused right up over here. So now you know that components are nothing but the elements which are placed on your web page, but now you need to understand how component would look in terms of code. So whenever you want to create a component, you usually create that component or you code that component inside a JavaScript file. So component code is placed inside a JavaScript file or a file with a .js extension. Now the best example of that would be the app component, which is actually placed inside the app.js file. So while taking a look at the directory structure for our React application, we saw that we have a app component which is created inside the app.js file. Now another thing about components is that you could create components in either of the two ways. You could either create a functional component or you could create a class component. So now once we understand what a component is, we now need to understand the different types of components. So let's first talk about a functional component. Now a functional component in JavaScript is nothing but it's simply a function which accepts some input called as props and returns an HTML which describes the user interface. So as with every function in any programming language, a function is nothing but it's like a black box which accepts some input and it returns some value. Now in case of React, a functional component acts in a similar way. So a functional component is React is nothing but it's simply a function which accepts something which is called as props or properties, and it returns HTML, and that HTML which is returned by that component describes the user interface. So this is what a functional component looks like. So here we simply have a function We have named this function as welcome, and as this is a component, it accepts a parameter called as props, or also called as properties. So the short form for properties is props. And then this component actually returns some HTML. So as you can see, it's returning some HTML here. And this particular HTML which is returned actually defines the user interface. So for example, if you create this component, it's simply going to render a heading tag on your home page. Now this function here can be called as a React component because it accepts a single prop and it returns a React element, which is nothing but this HTML right here. Now this technically looks like HTML, but it isn't exactly HTML. It is called as JSX, and we will be learning about JSX in the upcoming lectures. Now the next thing is, we call these types of components as functional components because they are literally JavaScript functions. So if you take a look at the syntax of creating components here, it's simply a function-based syntax. Just as the way you would create a normal function in JavaScript, we have created a component right here. And you don't have to worry about this props.name or the curly bracket write up over here. We are going to learn about that later when we write some actual component code. So this right here is what a functional component looks like. Now let's talk about class-based component or a class component. So just as we create functions in JS, we create a class in JavaScript to create a class-based component. Now a class component is nothing but its regular ES6 classes that extend from React's component class, and they must contain a render method which returns HTML. So let's take a look at what this component is. So we simply have a class and we have named this class as welcome, and as with any class in JavaScript, a class can extend another class. And in this case, as we are creating a React component, we are extending from a class which is called as react.component. So this component class is actually present inside the React library. We actually need to import that. The code to import that is not mentioned here for the sake of simplicity, but you could get the context here. So what this does is that it actually makes this regular class or turns this regular class into a React component. And whenever you create a class-based component in React, you always need to have this particular render method. And inside this render method, you should always return some sort of HTML. So this is what exactly is being done here. And again, you don't have to worry about this part right here. We will be learning about that later. You only need to understand that this is currently returning a heading tag and it has some text in here which is hello. So this is what a class component looks like. So this right here is a functional component which is defined in terms of a JavaScript function, and this right here is a class component which is defined in terms of ES6 class. So I hope this actually gives you an idea about what is a component and how it is defined in terms of code. So in the upcoming lecture, we will go ahead and straight away create our very first functional component. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.